Hey everyone, Viv here. In case you missed it, I wanted to let you know that we have a fortnightly email newsletter. We give you the latest recap on all things happening in our community. In there, you'll also be the first to know about our next events, merch drops, and exciting announcements. Head on over to levelasianpodcast.com/newsletter to sign up for the latest. Now, on to the episode.
What I didn't expect was the support from the community that I received. It's been very moving. Shortly after I gave my first speech in Parliament, which is, an opportunity for you to talk about who you are, talk about the things that you want to achieve. I really put my heart and soul in that speech. And at the end of it, I dedicated it to my grandmother, my ama. And I remember there was this one day where I was dropping my son off at school and this mum came up to me at the school gate and she said, "I heard your speech. I have an ama too, and I never thought that anyone would be talking about their ama in federal parliament." And then she started tearing up. And then she's tearing up. And then I started tearing up at the school gate.
Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode. In this episode of the Level Asian podcast, we're joined by Sally Sitou, who is the Labor member for the Division of Reid as of the 2022 Australian federal election. Sally talks to us about her journey of getting into politics, how her parents' migrant story and the community support have influenced her political work, and shares what it's been like navigating the limelight of being an MP. Sally also offers advice and wisdom for the younger generations seeking to be heard by people in the political space and provides guidance for those looking to get into politics. Enjoy the episode.
So one of the questions that came to mind immediately for me, and this was like as we were brainstorming questions, I was like, well, how would Sally Sitou describe herself? Because everyone describes you like from a media standpoint, politician, blah, 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 all these sort of things. But how would you sort of, describe yourself?
So I think this is both a really hard and easy question because it's quite broad, but it was a question that I was asked a lot during the campaign, and I think people would be quite surprised by how personal some of the questions can get during the campaign. People were, how many kids have you got? What religion are you? Do you have a mortgage? Like really deeply personal. Right. What, are you married? So I think I made a very conscious decision to just be very open about who I was because I ultimately understood why people were asking me those questions. They wanted to know who I was and whether or not they had similar values to me. And so I was quite open about being from a migrant background. My parents are Chinese, but they were born and raised in Laos, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to come to this country. And I talk about my first conversations with my parents about politics and their reticence and fear about talking about things like that because where they'd come from, there could be some real consequences if you spoke too openly about.
It's like a taboo subject.
Exactly. And in fact, my mum, I remember very early on said to me, you should never talk to people about politics and never tell them how you vote or who you support.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So you can imagine what a big deal it is for them then for their daughter to be not only a candidate but openly talking about the values that she has. But they are so much part of who I am and they are so much part of the reason why I put my hand up to stand that I am quite proud of where my family has come from and it's really driven me and I am a big believer in the power of education because I felt it through my own life. I went to two great public schools, Canterville Public School and then Sefton High School.
Crazy.
Another alumni.
Yep.
And had a fantastic university education. And then I worked in the university sector. So I saw it in my own life, but I also saw it in the lives of others. So that was also part of the reason why I decided to put my hand up to stand because I believe so strongly in the power of education to change lives, but also making sure that we give everyone that opportunity. So I think, that's a little bit about who I am. I'm a mum, a wife, a big lover of all food, and so a keen listener of Sydney Food Boys podcast. And great to see that he made the mainstream papers as well. And but I was like, oh no, now he has told everyone about that Laotian restaurant, which was one that I went to when I was growing up, and I was
Which one was this one? Was this Lao Village?
Yes.
Oh, the one
yes,
in Fairfield?
And I was like, yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, I know. You just ruined it for
everyone. So I, I decided really, really early on to be open about who I was.
As you were sort of going through growing up and stuff like that, like we're talking very stereotypically here. I don't know of many, besides our friend Tu Lee, who's decided to step into politics, that it is not of a traditional aspiration to move into something like politics, right? So at what stage during that process, because it sounded like it was sort of around, well, there was some formative stuff around your parents and the impact that they felt, sort of migrating from a country that maybe politics wasn't as, forthcoming. And then, of course, you growing up here, going through the schooling system and then uni as well. Can you sort of walk through where politics actually came and became involved, and when you started to go, oh, okay, this is actually something I would seriously now consider and I'd move into it?
Yeah, it is a very interesting question because it was very gradual for me. Like, there are some people who have read political memoirs their whole lives, have talked about it at the dining room table with their parents, and have had debates about it, but that wasn't the case for me. So I, when I was growing up, like I said, we never spoke about politics. The one thing my parents did talk to me about was unions. And they both worked in factories. So my dad worked in a factory making car parts, and my mum worked in a factory making telephone handsets. I don't know if you guys have...
Well, I'm older. She has no recollection of it.
That's what we used to have.
Yes.
So before the mobile phone. And they used to talk to me when I was younger about this thing called a union. And I don't think they really understood what a union was. It's like, the workers coming together to negotiate for better rights. I don't really think they understood that concept. The concept they understood was that every time there was some difficulty at work, there were these union reps who really helped them negotiate things at work. So for my father, he was quite badly injured at work, and it was his union that stepped in to talk to management about adjusting his work to accommodate his injury.
Right.
And then my mum, when telephone handsets were no longer being made, or, they were being offshored and being made overseas, her company went insolvent. And she'd been there for a long time, so she had banked up long service leave, annual leave. And there was real concern that her and her colleagues were not going to get any of that leave paid out.
Wow.
Yeah. But again, it was her union that took up the fight and ensured that they didn't get all their entitlements, but they got some of their entitlements. Mm-hmm. And so they always spoke about this union thing to me. And it was then that I started to realise there is real power in people coming together and fighting for something together, because as an individual, there's only so far you can get. But the power is in the collective and your ability to then work together and fight for something together. And I always kind of had that in the back of my head. But it wasn't until my parents are part of this very specific association, the Chinese Lao Australian. So it's a very small subset of the Asian Australian community. But they set up a community centre where they could all come together and sing karaoke and play mahjong and stuff like that. And I remember at the time I was a teenager, and the New South Wales Premier, Bob Carr, came and opened their association. He spoke, and this was during a time, and I think you might remember this, Khan, the kind of real challenges that Cabramatta was going through. gangs, drug capital of Australia,
Yep.
that period.
Yep.
And I remember he came and he spoke, but in a way that wasn't, we're going to come here and save you, you need tougher policing. It was very much what do you need from government? Like, you as a community, you understand what is happening here better than anyone. Mm-hmm. How can we help you? How can we be working with you? Mm. And the level of respect that he showed, I was really moved by that. I remember as a teenager being taken aback by this leader who was willing to spend all this time in this tiny community but show them the respect that I thought they deserved but hadn't received in a really long time. Mm. And I think that was quite powerful for me. And that was when I started to think about the role of politics, but also my role in that. So the role of politicians, but also the role of community to be involved as well. So I kind of had that bubbling away, but I didn't really get involved until later, towards the end of university. Joined the Labor Party because of those values about coming together and working together for things and making sure that everyone was given those opportunities. So like all of those values. And that's when I started to really catch the bug. Like, it was just wonderful to be part of a community of like-minded people who were trying to achieve the same thing, and, you know, talking about policy, getting to meet these amazing ministers and MPs. And then I worked on a couple of campaigns. I worked as a staffer, but then I kind of left politics and went out and worked in international aid in China and Samoa, came back, worked in the university sector for a while, and then the opportunity presented itself, and then I kind of grabbed it. And so it's not a kind of traditional, I've always had my eye on being a member of parliament. It just is that I've had an interest, shared values with the Labor Party, got involved, then stepped back and did other things. But then when an opportunity came, I really grabbed it.
I mean, there's a few things when you were saying that I had questions about. Number one was when Bob Carr came and spoke to the community, I'm just sort of like putting myself in that position. And I'm someone who really identifies my heritage as well, like being sort of Hokkien Chinese. And I could see myself obviously being quite moved by it. But also on the other side, there would be a lot of people who go, well, this doesn't really sort of apply to me. Or it's like there's sort of a disconnect, particularly with when you're sort of a child of a migrant, right? Sometimes that doesn't necessarily resonate because you're sort of all in your own world here and you're going through your own identity crisis. But why do you think it was for you to feel so moved by it, in the sense of like, well, he's coming here, the Premier's coming here to help out our community, but what was the struggle within the community that you guys, that, you know, you felt so strongly about as well? Because you mentioned drug capital, you know, Cabramatta being sort of a not so savoury area at the time, but what was the community itself struggling with? Yeah,
I don't know if you remember this time well, and like, let me know about whether or not this kind of jogs memories. But now that I've got my own child, I'm like, I can't believe I lived through that, and I can't even imagine what my parents were going through. But you know, I remember getting off, like I remember coming back from Sefton High, catching the train, getting off at Cabramatta Station, and as soon as I walked off the train, being offered drugs. And I just remember there was a period where you had to be home by 5 p.m. because it was unsafe to be out after that, or if you were out after that, you had to go to the library and stay in the library, and your parents picked you up from the library. And then there was a period where all the public spaces, including the public bathrooms, all had blue lighting so that people couldn't exactly. And then my childcare centre that I used to go to was closed down because they kept finding needles in I look back on that period now and I'm just like, oh my gosh, it is just incredible how far Cabramatta has come. But also it's incredible what we lived through as a community, because it was intense. I only kind of now that I'm a bit older and I'm a mum myself, I realise how intense that period was. But as a community, how resilient we were and how much we kind of pulled through, supported each other and got through that period. Mm-hmm. And like there were people that I went to school with who were in some serious trouble mm-hmm. with the police and who had really awful drug addictions. Like it was very real and present in my kind of teenage years and formative years when I was growing up. And it almost felt like at the time, like, how do we solve this problem? How do we get out of this?
Was it like a hopelessness type thing for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think a little bit less so because in a way going to Sefton High was mm-hmm. like I was a bit removed from it. Mm. I wasn't going to school in the area, so for me it was less of that hopelessness, but I could feel it for the community. Mm. And I just think that it ultimately needed the community to really step up and make that change because, yes, the New South Wales government did allocate more policing resources, more community resources, and that was really important. Mm. But ultimately, we needed the community to step up and be supporting each other, be looking out for each other. And I was really lucky because that Chinese, Lao, Australian group of aunties and uncles, I think we all kind of had that growing up, was that they were always like looking out for you. If you were doing the wrong thing, your mum and dad heard about it straight away. So yeah, there was just incredible resilience. Like, and if you think about what our communities have gone through, having to leave a country to come here and try to settle, and then having to go through all of those difficulties, I'm just blown away by how much we've had to endure, but how much we've really come through and shone.
And it would have been like really vivid for you because like you said, coming out of Cabramatta Station, just like getting offered like drugs on the spot. I used to remember walking around Cabramatta, and probably I was maybe a few years sort of difference out. Like I think Cabramatta was sort of already on its way to getting better. And I remember if you looked at certain people the wrong way, you would cop it in one way or another, right? It was like that sort of thing. It was like head down, just where you, like you said, head to the library where you needed to go. That was sort of what Cabra really felt like for me. And so, I grew up in the Chester Hills, so more Bankstown area, but there was a lot of similarities there, probably not as extreme as Cabramatta, but I remember hearing stories about it. And I'd also remember stories about, growing up in high school, walking from Sefton High School to the train station. Yeah. And you'd have to be very careful. You'd never walk alone. You'd always have to walk in groups because there was all these alleyways because you have to jump a few blocks to the train stations, and that's where you used to get jumped. And so there was all these sort of things where like, you kind of have to be careful about who the relationships you built. Maybe that was just the era that I grew up in. But I guess to fast forward, you mentioned going through university. I'm curious to know, what did you study during uni? Yeah,
I did a psychology degree at Mac Uni.
Okay.
I didn't then go on to become a psychologist, but I feel like I've put some of that understanding
to use
and lessons to practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so of course you mentioned that's when you really got into the tail end of uni, where you sort of had much more fondness and got more involved in politics as well.
Yeah.
And then you said you went away from it. So I'd love to know a little bit about you sort of going overseas and things like that. So you meant like ForeignAid and things like that. What was that experience like? Oh,
it was amazing. So I went on an Australian government program, and it was called Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development. And I went to Beijing in 2008. Tail end of 2008, 2009. So it was just post Beijing Olympics. And it was just an extraordinary time. I worked with a NGO that did advocacy work for the elderly in China. A very interesting policy space because there's a real kind of tradition that it's the family that looks after the elderly.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so therefore government support and services wasn't very strong. But then, of course, China's got this other problem where because of their they used to have a one-child policy, no longer in place now, but it meant that there was one child who was looking after a set of parents and then 4 grandparents. And the kind of burden of that on that one child was enormous. And it was a really interesting time because the government was just starting to grapple with that and starting to realise that there was a need for government to step in and provide support. And I was coming in and able to start to introduce the ideas of what Australia has. So with our super system, which is world class, it forces you to save from as soon as you start working, so that when you retire, you've got some money to live off. Which is the reason my parents are doing okay. Like they're in their own house and they've got a bit of money. My dad receives a small part pension, but mostly it's their own savings and their own hard work. But it's because of the superannuation system.
Yep.
And then, of course, letting them know about our pension system. And so, yeah, it was just a really interesting time to be doing that work. But it was a really interesting time to be in China as well, because it was during the GFC, and Australia's fortunes were so closely tied with what China was doing. And essentially, Australia was able to come out of the GFC largely unscathed because of that economic connection with China. So it was a very interesting time to be there. Learnt an incredible amount, travelled around that place. The other place I ended up living is Samoa, which is completely different. This tiny Pacific island. And I was working with ForeignAid at the time. And I mean, anyone who goes to Samoa will tell you it is just spectacularly beautiful and still very much untouched. And just, the bluest oceans you will see, and just very vibrant. And you can see it in the way they dress as well. They wear the loudest colours. It was extraordinary. But underneath all of that, there are some real challenges. High rates of domestic violence, real challenges from a health perspective. So we were doing a lot of work with bringing Australian ophthalmologists over to do work with Samoans, because and I was talking to one of the doctors and I said, what's the difference between your work in Australia and your work here in Samoa? He said that in Australia, if someone had diabetes, they don't lose their eyesight because you treat it early and it doesn't lead to problems with your eyesight. In Samoa, the problem is that they're not treating their diabetes early enough. Right. And so by the time these ophthalmologists see them, they're in danger of losing their eyesight from a preventable, like a disease that can be managed. And that's the real difference. So beautiful country. Everyone should go there. It's just spectacular. But underneath that, real challenges.
So then how did you get back into politics after that then?
Politics has always been something that I've so I did work as a staffer for a couple of years for Jason Clare. And then when I went out and did work elsewhere, I always had an interest, like I kept it out. I think my thinking about politics is the healthy way to go about it is to have it as something that you're interested in, and more as perhaps an interest and a hobby as opposed to
career politics.
You've got the eye on the prize and you're going for it, because that was never going to be a good approach for me, because politics is a really tough game. It doesn't always necessarily result in the best person becoming a politician, and it can be difficult and quite brutal at points. But if you keep it as something that you're interested in and that you volunteer on and you help out and you're driven by the values, then I think you become less jaded, and that you can then maintain that interest on the side, which is what I did. So when I was not involved working in it, I still would go to my branch meetings and meet up with friends who I knew from the Labor Party, still volunteer and get involved in campaigns, because that is all really rewarding as well. But I got back involved because a couple of the people in the local area had said, we need someone to run, and they said, we think it should be you. And really at that stage, it was not, federal politics was not something that I had even entertained. In fact, I was on the local council ticket. I was thinking, I'll join Strathfield Council because there were a couple of parks that I wanted to see upgraded. There was some programs, community programs that I thought would be helpful. So I was on the Strathfield Council ticket to run to be a councillor, and there was an opportunity because they needed a candidate for that seat of Reid. And at the time I was talking to a couple of friends and they said to me, it's unlikely you're going to get in this time, but how about you give it a go, and if you do well, they might let you run again, and that's when you've got a better chance. And I had been talking about how we needed more diversity in our parliament for it to better reflect the communities that they're supposed to be representing. And I thought it'd be disingenuous of me to not put my hand up. But also there were some things that I really cared about. So education, but also acting on climate change. And they all were shaped by me thinking about what sort of world I was going to be leaving my son, and, what was my role in helping to shape that world for him. And so I figured I'll put my hand up and give it a good go, never really expecting that I'd be in a position where I'd been with a real shot to win.
Well, you've mentioned, that a lot of the work has been influenced by, your son, but also the years of experience that you've had with the community. Like, how has that influenced the current work that you're doing as well and what you're implementing? So the things that we've been really focused on is how do we better support the community. And I'll give you a few examples. And these are members of the community who might not previously have been able to get the support that they needed. So one of the events that I ran with the member for Strathfield, Jason Lee, and we work really closely together. But we put together this thing that we called the Government Services Hub, where we brought 3 levels of government, so federal, state and council, together in the one room.
Oh, wow.
Some of the agencies that you need to talk to, Medicare, Centrelink, Housing, NDIS, and bring those agencies in the one room so that if you've got an issue, instead of being bounced around, no, that's a state government you need to talk to. It's come on this day at this time, and then you can speak to someone from Centrelink, you can speak to someone from Medicare or Housing. And the other crucial thing that we did was we really helped promote it in the Chinese community. So we had translated materials. We told all the agencies, you need to bring a Chinese translator. And it was held in Burwood, so a big Chinese community, and really targeted that community to say, in essence, we know it has been difficult for you to get the help that you need and to find out about the government support that you can get. So we are holding this event for you so that you can get that help. You're not going to be able to get the help immediately on the day, but at least you know which agency you need to speak to. At least you know, this is a Centrelink issue. I'm in the right spot, and then pursue it down that way. So we've been really trying to engage those communities who may have not been able to get the help that they need, or not known how to get in touch with their local member of parliament. And I think Jason and myself were perhaps uniquely positioned to understand that community, because, I remember my parents, like, if they ever had any issues, they would never go to their local member of parliament, never think to, they would just go to their friend who would give them bad advice.
Yep.
I think this was something that I was very acutely aware of and really wanted to drive, was just being out in the community. And in fact, my team don't want to see me in the office. They're like, you should be out all the time. And I think that's the way you do become a good member of parliament, if you're out listening to people, meeting with people, and that they can see you and that you're approachable.
That would have had a really big ripple effect, I guess, or just a big impact on communities that might not have felt heard a lot of the time, like you mentioned. Did you get any immediate feedback or hear any feedback from the community from all the work that you did?
Yeah, it has been a very surprising part of this role. So I knew that it would be a big deal for many in the community, because it is still quite rare to see someone of a different background in our federal parliament. I don't think I realised how big a deal it was. Like, certainly from the, we understand the community, so we're trying to help service them. But I think there are other federal MPs who aren't of a particular cultural background, but they get it. I just think of my immediate neighbours, Jerome Luxall, who's the member for Bennelong, and Andrew Charlton, who's the member for Parramatta. They are deeply engaged with connecting with their community and have been out and they do very similar outreach work to what I'm doing. What I didn't expect was the incredible support from the community that I received, but in a way that's been very moving. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Like, there was one shortly after I gave my first speech in Parliament, which is, an opportunity for you to talk about who you are and talk about the things that you want to achieve. So, I kind of really put my heart and soul in that speech. And at the end of it, I dedicated it to my grandmother, my ama. And I remember there was this one day where I was dropping my son off at school, and this mum came up to me at the school gate and she said, "I heard your speech. I have an ama too, and I never thought that anyone would be talking about their ama in federal parliament." And then she started tearing up, and then she's tearing up, and then I started tearing up at the school gate. It was pretty.
Really
with the kids there, like, "Mum, stop crying! What are you doing? You're embarrassing me."
I think there was a bit of that. So it was really something. And there've been a couple of times when I've been out with my son and some people have stopped me and said, "Thank you so much. It really, it means a lot to us that you're in Parliament and that you understand us." So, and I think it's great for him to see. And in fact, he said to me the other day, he was like, "Mummy," I think it was Isabel from year 2 said, "Max, your mummy's really kind." And he said, "Why are you kind, mummy?" And I said, I'm not sure. What did Isabel say? And he said, "Oh, she said, because your mummy's always trying to help people." And I was like, like that mother's guilt of not being around and available is appeased a little bit. Yeah.
Well, the other thing was, like, kids at that age already know about politics, watching speeches and consuming all of that as well.
Yeah, it's really lovely.
Yeah, like, I think there's always, obviously there's a sort of the media side to things, but I think there's a lot of wonderful things I imagine in politics. I'm not in the space, but the interactions that you get on, a regular basis and seeing the direct impact, right, and how people react to it is really nice.
And I think, the other thing that's extraordinary is that you are in this privileged position to be invited into communities that you would you wouldn't ordinarily have an opportunity to meet. So I was at a Tamil festival at one of their temples, and it was just an extraordinary, like lots of colour and, you know, devotion, and it was beautiful to see. And they were so generous with explaining their cultures and traditions. But my life before politics, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. Right. And I'm just very grateful for all the community groups for just their generosity of spirit and in welcoming me. But I feel like there's this beautiful insight that I get into all these different communities. But ultimately, you know, migrant communities share so many similar threads and values of working hard and wanting a better life for their kids. So it was really lovely to see.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show.
Well, that actually, I think of this question now, it's like prior to getting into or becoming an MP, what are some expected or even unexpected, how do I frame this up, experiences or doors that have opened that you're like, holy crap, this is amazing. And of course doesn't get the sort of limelight or the spotlight, you know, you're like, well, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, you know, it's a very rewarding thing. Is there anything that you can sort of share there?
Yeah, there've been some individuals that we've been really able to help. And, you know, one of the things that I try to do with the team is to really celebrate those wins. So one example is there was a period there where because of COVID and some things that the previous government had done, there was a real lag in people getting their passports. And this is something that has never been experienced before. Like there was just a rush of people who wanted passports, and then there weren't enough staff because they'd kind of been let go during that COVID period. And there were really desperate situations where someone had to go and see a dying father and couldn't get the passport in time, or was concerned about, you know, the potential difficulty with coming back because they were on a particular type of visa. So the team helped them get that resolved and push that through the system. And so they were able to then go overseas and spend those final weeks with their dad. And one person was able to get their partner visa that they'd been waiting so long for. And I think it was those individuals who we've helped, and it makes the role really rewarding from that individual perspective. But then when I think about the kind of bigger policy pieces that we've been trying to work on, one is, you know, something that I feel really strongly about, which is making childcare more affordable. I felt the relief when my son went to kindergarten and we didn't have to pay the childcare fee.
So expensive.
So expensive. Spaces are difficult to get into.
Yep. I'm in that. I've got a 4-month-old and people are like, you've got to start looking now. And it's, and I'm only just getting my head around it now. So I'd love to hear.
So are you now having, as a parent, having to decide with you and your partner how many days you?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And like, how many days do we do? You know, you got the grandparents, how many days can we do that? And then of course, what's a great childcare center versus a one that we may not decide on going with? I'm even wrapping my head around what's the difference between family daycare and childcare centers. You know, there's a lot of complexity in the system, and we're talking about obviously the standards, things like that. And then of course the affordability aspect of it, which I was looking at going, how does, like, I'm a business owner, I'm in a fortunate position where I probably make a little bit more, but I'm just going, well, is someone who's on a wage or a salary, how can they afford this?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And we know also that, you know, if one parent drops out of work, it's so much harder for them to get back into it again in a few years' time because you've lost those connections. And so what we're doing is making childcare more affordable by bumping up the childcare subsidy that families are able to get, and that's going to benefit 96% of families. So that's one piece of the puzzle, is to make it more affordable, so that when you're making that decision about, do I go back 3 days or 2 days, it's a decision that you make based on what's best for your family, not how are we going to be able to afford it. So that's one thing. So from 1st of July, families should start to see their fee come down, the top up that they've got to pay come down. The other more challenging piece is, how do we make this work more attractive for people? And anyone who has a child in childcare just realises how much of a godsend those early educators are. I saw the dramatic difference in my son when he was home with me versus when he was in childcare. Like, he was coming back and like teaching me about all the planets. And I was like, oh, you forgot Pluto. He goes, Mummy, Pluto's not a planet. I was like, right. So we all think that childcare is good for kids because of all that amazing learning and socialising that they get. And then we all think it's good for parents because you get to decide how your career is going to shape out, and you get to decide how many days you want to work. But it's also really good for our society as well. Like, if we have productive parents who get to work as many days as they would like, kids who are being educated in these good quality education centres, that's good for all of us. But what we've failed to do is really value those early educators. So, they're doing incredibly demanding jobs, but that are so important, and yet we're paying them sometimes a minimum wage, when for many of them, like, they can't really live off that. So one of the things that we really tried to do was increase the minimum wage for them. So we've pushed for that, and we've achieved that. But also, we need to make the profession more attractive. Like, we need to elevate it and be like, we as a society value our early educators. So we're doing a lot of work around how do we give them better career pathways, so that they see an opportunity for them to grow in that career. How do we give them better training and support? But how do we just kind of elevate it and talk about? That's why we don't talk about childcare workers. We call them early educators, because that is what they are. They are educators. They are as important as teachers, as important as university lecturers, and they're not babysitters. And so we've done away with that language, and we really want to start just elevating the profession. And there's going to be a lot of work that needs to happen around that.
This is a bit of a curly question, and I might be asking it the wrong way, but certainly as I was coming up with sort of questions to ask, one of the things that I was thinking was, like, if I was in your position, and I consider myself a fairly sort of, I keep to myself and sort of doing my own thing, and then to be sort of not thrusted, but like now you're in sort of a much more public profile. Do you ever get, I guess, imposter syndrome, particularly in the early days? Did you ever struggle with sort of going, right, this is now my role, my reality now, and then how do you go about it? Like, what was sort of the internal emotions when you got into politics in a, particularly on a federal level, and then how did you deal with it?
I don't necessarily think it's imposter syndrome, and it's often a question that's asked of women as well. Not to call you out on this, but I don't think it's imposter syndrome. I think there's doubt, absolutely, like whether or not you're up for the role or the challenge or whatever. But like, if I think about a federal member of parliament, like, who is that person? What is the right fit for that? Like, there is no one model, so why can't it be me? And in fact, in my first speech, I said, it should be me. It should be someone like, not necessarily me, but it should be someone like me. It should be someone who is from a diverse background, representing a diverse electorate. That is a good good fit. And we should change the way we think about what a federal politician looks like or what a politician looks like generally. We should change the way we think about what a CEO looks like or what the head of a public department looks like. So I don't think it's imposter syndrome as such. Certainly there was doubt about whether I could do it, whether or not I was up for the task. But, you know, I've seen mediocre people become members of parliament. If they can do it, I'm surely just as good as them.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that is important, though, is that I didn't. So I guess people should never underestimate their ability to rise to meet a moment, but that moment has to be the right one at the right time. So if you had said to me, you've got to go do a national TV interview live straight off the bat, I think I would have failed. But I didn't do that straight off the bat. It was incremental. So, you know, the steps for me to get to where I am now, first I had to do a pre-selection ballot, which involved calling all the Labor Party branch members in my local area, and I had to tell them why I should be the candidate. And that was really good training for me because I was forced to explain who I was and the values I held and what I wanted to do for the community. And then from there, I was out in the community meeting people. Again, really good training because I had to answer tough questions. And then I did a radio interview, you know, slightly lower stakes than a live TV interview, but I learned how to do that. And then it kind of built up from there. So if the leap had been, you know, do a national TV live breakfast thing straight away, it would have been incredibly challenging. But the moments came at the right time and I was able to meet each of those moments and they got incrementally harder.
Yeah, makes sense.
I just want to ask, like, take a slightly different turn. Like, you've spoken about a lot of representation and having more cultural representation in politics. And I know that there's also a big shift in generational, I guess, Gen Z movements as well, or millennials as well, who have put their voices forward and, like, they've all become a collective who are very, very passionate about what the future holds for them. However, I also know that in Parliament, there is a big generational divide between ages. I don't know if I'm generalizing, but from your experience, do you kind of see this new shift coming along, but also a clash between the two generations as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because there is now a real shift in the Australian demographics where now I think it is that baby boomers are no longer the dominant generation. It's actually now the millennials / Gen Z. So our politics does not yet reflect that demographic shift, but it's slowly getting there. So if I think about who I'm in Parliament with, so I'm a geriatric millennial. I think I just make it in. But if I think about my colleagues, the Minister for Aged Care is Annika Wells. She's a millennial. Senator Fatima Payman, she's 27. Dr. Gordon.
I didn't know she was 27.
27.
Really? Wow.
And she's incredible, amazing. Dr. Gordon Reid, I think he's 29. So there are some people who are coming through who do reflect that Gen Z millennial generation. And I think that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. Because as with any organisation, you benefit from having diversity around the table to improve the decision making. But I think even more so in politics because you are supposed to be representative of the community. So you need to have those views around the table so that the policies better help people in the community. And I think about what some of our younger generation have been able to achieve, where perhaps older generations have been a bit slow on. And climate change is one of the ones that strikes me as a very good example. Mm-hmm. You know, you had a period of a decade where not much was being done. People were still arguing about whether or not climate change was real.
Yep.
And then you had these school strikes where school students were demanding politicians to listen and act. And I think in many ways it was that movement that pushed politicians into action. And, you know, I think that's really powerful, and that growing voice within the younger generations is incredible. I just want to make sure that we're listening and acting and harnessing that. I'm not sure if we're doing that as well as we could be, but certainly with this new group of millennials and Gen Zs that are coming into our parliament, I think that really puts us in a better position.
I guess the question is, this might be also a loaded one, but say, I'll give you, like the example that I can give is my sister's just spent this whole week, I was telling Ken before, in Canberra because she's studying part of her degree is part of politics.
Oh, great.
So she spent the week in Canberra.
Did she enjoy it?
I asked her, I was on a phone call before this and I was like, so how have you enjoyed it? She's like, yeah, I just spent the week visiting Parliament. I was like, okay, and anything else? She was like, no, that's it. I was like, okay, I'll dig it out of her at dinner tonight. But like for a generation like hers, she's very, very vocal about this kind of stuff, and so are her friends. And like you said, they might not feel like they're being listened to. Do you have words of advice in the sense of what can they do to feel like they are being listened to, or what are the certain methods that you feel like they might be heard from people in Parliament and I guess in the political space as well?
Well, I mean, it sounds like she's on the right track if she's already in this program where she's spending time in Parliament. And I think that there is now, certainly with our government, there is a real desire to make sure that we are listening to young people. So one of the first things that we did was we have a Minister for Youth, and she has set up a youth advisory body, and they are some of the most extraordinary people who I can't quite remember the age range, but I think it's 16 to mid 20s, and from across the country, from different backgrounds. You meet any one of them and you will just be floored by how much they've been able to achieve in the very young age. But they are there to advise the government about the issues that they care about. And the Minister for Youth set up an agency for the first time to look at these issues. So I think one is to get involved with local youth groups and organisations that are working on issues that you care about. So, you know, if it's climate, get involved with some of the climate groups and make sure that your voice is heard in those groups. But you know, you can get involved with your local member of parliament and go directly to them. So one of the great things that I get to do is meet with school groups. I love meeting with school groups in the electorate, but I also love meeting with them when they come to Canberra for a visit. And usually that's around grade 5 and 6. I remember when it was being offered at my school. I'd signed up, but I was sick that week, so I didn't get to go. No. But they are like, when I meet with them in Parliament House, they have been taught about, you know, this is how a bill gets made. This is the process. But I like to set them a little homework task, and that is to say, what are the things that you care about? What are the ideas that you have to improve our local community? And it is inviting them to be part of that, because ultimately that's where you get ideas for policies, and you need to get those ideas from somewhere. So what better place than this young generation that are so enthusiastic and brimming with ideas and advice for us, and something that we need to listen to.
So then the question, this might segue into it. If you're someone who, looks like us, sort of ethnic background, migrant, and you want to get into politics. So I remember we asked Tu this question, and her response was, sometimes there's not so much a straightforward path. There's many ways in. And certainly I think her path was through university as well, where she got involved with sort of the Young Labor Party. If you sort of had to encapsulate well, here are some options for you outside of what you just mentioned, if someone wants to get into it and actually sort of, and I know your advice was don't do it as a career thing. It's more of a, hey, this is a sort of passion thing and you do on the side. But if there was someone who wanted to be a bit more invested in it, and I actually can think of a few people in my head, what would be the advice, or where would you start? Yeah.
So first and foremost, my advice for any young person interested in politics is to really think about why. So it's the values piece. It's, what do you care about? What do you want to see changed? I don't think people should just do it for the sake of it, or for the, the power,
the glory.
Or the glory.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, standing at a train station at 7 a.m. when it's raining, trying to hand someone a flyer.
It ain't glorious.
Not glorious. So you got to be in it for the right reasons, and you got to figure out what it is you care about. Then I think the key is to think about how do you want to get involved, because it isn't necessarily the easiest pathways to get involved through a political party. So, once you figure out your values and which political party best aligns with you, you would join up, and then you'd start kind of working and volunteering in that political party. And that's the path that Tu and I took. And it was really fun, and you got to meet some great people. And I think that's a really good way of doing it. There are other ways to get in as well. So people get involved in unions because, they think workers' rights are really important, and they want to be activists and help support people and make sure that they're being looked after at work. And I think that is incredibly valuable work. Then there's ways of doing it through NGOs, advocating for an issue. If you care about the environment, being involved in those groups, and getting that experience around how do you advocate, how do you communicate, how do you work with different stakeholders. I think all of those are really valuable skills. Being involved in politics without that values piece, without the what it is that I want to change, I think it's very hollow. So yeah, making sure that you've got that right. Then the other thing is, I think it is so valuable because, like Tu said, it's not a straightforward path. It's not like oh, you go to uni, then you get good marks, and then you get a job, and unfortunately, it's not always merit based either. So part of it is having people that you feel safe talking to, trusted mentors who could guide you through. And I was really lucky that I had that because it wouldn't have been something that I would have been able to navigate on my own. And, not growing up with politics being discussed or my parents having any connections, it was about finding those people who could help me through. And
one of the other things in the prep notes during the call was, and you mentioned your son a few times, which is, I'm at an age now and I'm literally on the market right now looking to buy a home.
Oh, yes.
And, we talk about sort of the previous generation, the baby boomers, and I'm a millennial. And then, you got Gen Zs as well. The sort of issue around what is now attainable as a realistic expectation, right? Affordability being a massive problem. We talked about childcare. What's your stance on that? And what are you sort of excited about? Because obviously childcare affordability is one thing, but is there anything else coming up from that perspective that you think is really good? I think we've seen a real shift from my parents' generation.
So if you imagine, like I just think about how extraordinary their story is, because you come to this country, you speak very little English, had very little formal education. I think my parents both got up to the equivalent of year 8 or something. Had some networks, but you didn't really understand the way things worked here. And then within 5 years, you were able to get 2 really good, secure jobs and buy a place for yourself in Sydney. Like, that's extraordinary. Like, if you think about, would that happen now? I'm not sure it would. I don't think my parents would have been able to get good, secure jobs with good conditions, and they certainly wouldn't have been able to buy a place. And so the shift from that time to now is dramatic. And you know, part of the problem is that there are not enough houses for people to be buying. There's incredible demand, but not enough stock, not enough, apartments or houses. And then there's not the supporting infrastructure as well, where there are dwellings. So you're having to live really far away from where you work, or you're having to drive in because there's no public transport for you. So there are a whole range of issues that will require all 3 levels of government to work closely together with, to help solve this issue of housing affordability. And it's been a long time in the making. Like, I'm lucky now that my husband and I have a place, but I remember when we were looking, and it was an awful few months there where every weekend was being taken up with looking at houses, and then the kind of letdown of not getting the place that you wanted. I think in the end we ended up buying because we were just so sick of looking.
You settled with one.
We just, that one will do. And we can afford it. And so I think that compact that used to be, it kind of used to be like an unwritten compact where it's like, if you worked hard, you would be able to afford to buy a place for yourself. I think that's broken now. How do we fix it? I've got no easy answer for that. But certainly some of the things that we need to do is we need to have greater investment in social and affordable housing. And so this is, yes, kind of housing commission, what we used to think of as housing commission. And a lot of good friends of mine grew up in housing commission and are like incredibly successful pharmacists and doctors now. Our Prime Minister grew up in government housing. We need more investment in that, because if you don't have a good, secure place to live, all the other stuff is so much harder. Being able to learn at school, being able to hold down a job, so much harder if you don't have a place to live. And then having more affordable housing. So that's not social government-owned housing, but housing where it's slightly below the market rate. And that's for our nurses, our teachers, our frontline workers. So they're not having to live 50 kilometres away from where they're working. So we need greater investment in that. And so that's one of the things that was a real priority for the Prime Minister, was to be investing in that. So we've got goals of 30,000 affordable and social housing, and I may have gotten that number
fact check it after.
Wrong. But investment, $10 billion investment in getting some of these houses built. But we do need a rethink of how we do this, because at the moment we've got big apartment blocks going up, developers doing quite well, but there's no conditions on the amount of affordable housing that they have to have in that block. So why aren't we, working with the private sector to make sure that they can still make their profits and still do quite well out of it, but that there is that affordable housing that is being offered to people who need it. Like I said, our teachers, our nurses, our childcare workers who wouldn't be able to afford to live close to work otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours.
Yeah,
I
we could.
suppose.
There's so many questions.
But yeah, certainly I think, I guess a way to wrap it up would just be, do you have anything else that you're either excited about, anything you want to share? I guess to describe the audience, the name's pretty self-explanatory, Level Asian, predominantly Asian. I think, most of our demographics range primarily, obviously we sort of skew to this. You're like a 25 to 34 years, so working professional entrepreneurs, business owners, a lot of them. Anything that I guess you wanted to say, any advice about what you're currently doing?
I don't think so much it's advice from me, but what I have been what I've been floored by is listening to many of the guests on your show and how much they've been able to achieve. Like, I think it was Tomiko who started Sprint Law. I know him through a friend, and listening to him and his partner talk about how they grew that business, like, I was inspired by that. So not so much advice, but just how excited I am to see a group of young Asian Australians really making their mark on the world. And it is very exciting to see. But I guess the flip side of that is that as an Asian Australian, you don't have to be an overachiever as well. Like, It's okay just to be. You don't have to prove anything. So, I've got some wonderful cousins who are just extraordinary, and they're in the kind of Gen Z category. And one works at DFAT, one's super senior at Sydney Trains, and one's an engineer. And I think that's great. And we ought to celebrate successful Asian Australians and talk about their contribution to this country. But it's okay to also just exist. Be who you are. Yeah. You don't have to be super successful and achieving, and you can just be who you are and not have to justify yourself. And I guess that's when you can really say you're part of this country. We don't always have to sell the migrant story. We are just part of this country.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really strong to leave that on as well. But before we wrap up, the last thing to ask you is, where can people find more about what you're doing, or can they find you online?
Yes. So I am on all the socials except TikTok. And also I've got a website, so sallysitou.com.
Amazing. We'll leave that all in the show notes as well. But thank you so much, Sally, for coming onto the podcast today. It was great to hear your story.
Oh, it was great to chat with you both.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.